Well, here we are, next to last presentation today. You realize that we have one this evening, right?
Yes.
This evening we are going to study lesson number 17. We've covered the seals. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the seal of God and the mark of the beast. But the one that we're going to study now is lesson 18. It's page 355 in your syllabus. Lesson number 18. The title is The Papacy, the Jesuits, and the Sabbath. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, as we study this very important lesson, I especially ask that you will bless those who are watching the live stream. Perhaps there are people that have never understood this before. I ask, Lord, that you will give them tender hearts, not only to understand, but to pay attention and to receive the message that you have for them. Also to us as well here in the studio. Thank you for the promise of your presence. And we ask it in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. In Revelation 14, we have God's final message to planet Earth before the second coming. It's known as the three angels' message. And we are now going to read the first angel's message, and we're going to focus particularly on one part of the first angel's message. I'm reading from Revelation 14, 6 and 7. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment has come. And now comes the part that I want to underline or emphasize. And worship Him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So the first angel's message commands us to worship the Creator. Now, in order to understand fully what it means to worship the Creator, we have to go back to where the Creator created. We have to go back to Genesis. Now, I want you to notice that the days of creation spoken of in Genesis chapter 1 were literal 24-hour days like we know them today. And I'm going to begin by giving you several evidences from Genesis 1 that the days of creation were literal 24-hour days just like we know them today. And you're going to see the reason why I'm underlining this particular point. First of all, the Hebrew lexicons, those are the dictionaries that explain the meaning of Hebrew words, the best lexicons all state that the days of Genesis 1, the writer is referring to literal 24-hour days. That's the definition that is given in the dictionaries or in the lexicons. Secondly, 250 times, approximately, the word day appears in the Old Testament, and with a numeral qualifier. In every single instance in which the word day appears with a numeral qualifier, it refers to a 24-hour day. And that's the case in Genesis. It was the evening and morning, first day, second day, third day. When the word day appears with the number qualifier, it means a literal day. In the third place, each day had an evening and morning. It would be ridiculous to say it was the evening and morning of the first million years. Evening and morning is marked by the rising and setting of the sun. It clearly indicates that the writer of Genesis believed that the days of creation were literal 24-hour days marked off by the evening and the morning. Another evidence is Psalm 33 and verse 9. The language of creation is a language of immediacy, of quickness, not long periods. It says there that God spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. That's a language of quickness, rapidity, in other words. There's an expression in the story of creation also that indicates that the process of creation was done expeditiously. In Genesis 1, verses 7, 11, 15, and 24, we find this expression that after God creates something, it says, and it was so. Once again, it gives the impression that God speaks, and it's so when God speaks. Probably the greatest evidence that the days of creation were literal is the fourth commandment. Because the fourth commandment says that we are to work 6 and rest the 7th, because God worked 6 and rested the 7th. We could never follow God's example if the days of creation were millions of years long. They have to be literal days. Because if we're going to work 6 and rest the 7th like God did, well, then the days at the beginning had to be days just like the ones we know now. So the fourth commandment proves that the days of creation were literal days. Then we have the testimony of the New Testament writers. Did the New Testament writers believe that the story of creation happened literally just the way that the book of Genesis says? Absolutely. You know, you have, for example, Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. You know, Jesus understood that the story of Adam and Eve and the first marriage in history was a literal story. Notice chapter 19 of the book of Matthew, verse 4 through verse 6. And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. Did Jesus believe that Adam and Eve were real people? Did he perform the first marriage? Yes. So the story of creation is literal. The days must have been literal. Of course, Ellen White confirms that the days of creation were literal days. In Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, page 85, she wrote, I was then carried back to the creation, and was shown that the first week in which God performed the work of creation in 6 days and rested on the 7th day was just like every other week. The great God, in his days of creation and day of rest, measured off the first cycle as a sample for successive weeks till the close of time. And in an even more explicit statement, in Testimonies to Ministers, page 135, she wrote, when the Lord declares that he made the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, he means the day of what? Of 24 hours, which he has marked off by the rising and setting of the sun. But not only do we find this testimony in the Bible, for the reasons that I gave you, not only in the writings of Ellen White, but also conservative Protestant scholars have gone on the record saying that the days of creation were literal days. Notice, for example, this statement by Henry Morris, who was a staunch creation scientist. His headquarters were in San Diego. He died a few years ago. In his book, Biblical Creationism, he wrote on page 62, the Lord himself had worked 6 days, then rested on the 7th, setting thereby a permanent pattern for the benefit of mankind. So he shows also that there are non-Adventist conservative scholars that believe that the days of creation were literal days. And the first week was a week of 7 days, just like we know the week today. Yet Ellen White wrote that some theologians want to accommodate the story of creation to the whims of science, so-called. So they say, yes, God was involved, but he took millions of years for each day. Notice this statement in the book Education, page 128 and 129. Inferences erroneously drawn from facts observed in nature have, however, led to a supposed conflict between science and revelation. And in the effort to restore harmony, then interpretations of Scripture have been adopted that undermine and destroy the force of the Word of God. Geology has been thought to contradict the literal interpretation of the Mosaic record of the creation. Millions of years, it is claimed, were required for the evolution of the earth from chaos. And in order, notice the word, to accommodate the Bible to this supposed revelation of science, the days of creation are assumed to have been vast, indefinite periods covering thousands or even millions of years. Such a conclusion is wholly uncalled for. The Bible record is in harmony with itself and with the teaching of nature. So I want you to notice that Ellen White, conservative Protestant scholars, and the testimony of Genesis itself indicates that the story of creation is a literal story. The first week was composed of 7 days, each 24 hours long. Yet, in spite of the fact of the evidence, the papacy's concept of creation is different. Neither John Paul II, who is one of the most influential popes in recent years, or Francis I, the present pope, believes that the story of creation occurred as it is written. Both believed, well, Francis believes, and John Paul II believed before he died, that the story of creation is a symbolic story that wants to teach moral lessons, but it did not happen literally. Both of them believe in the Big Bang, that the world evolved over the course of billions of years. In other words, both believed that this world came into existence by what we call macroevolution. Not slight, small variations within species, but drastic changes from one species to another. John Paul, in a speech to the Papal Academy of the Sciences, referred to evolution as more than a hypothesis and argued that the various branches of science have presented a significant argument in favor of the theory. I want to read what he said. Today, almost half a century after the publication of the encyclical, he's talking about the encyclical of Pope Pius XII, Humane Generis, which means on the origin of man. He started saying, well, maybe there's a little truth to evolution. Before that, the papacy was not strong on the idea that things came into existence by evolution. So the Pope is saying, today, almost half a century after the publication of the encyclical, new knowledge has led to the recognition of the theory of evolution as more than a hypothesis. It is indeed remarkable that this theory has been progressively accepted by researchers following a series of discoveries in various fields of knowledge. The convergence, that is, of all of these different studies, the convergence neither sought nor fabricated of the results of the work that was conducted independently is in itself a significant argument in favor of the theory. That's what Pope John Paul said to the Papal Academy of the Sciences. Now, Stephen Swanson, who was a staff writer for the Chicago Tribune, was brutally honest when he wrote that Darwin's evolution and the biblical record of creation cannot be reconciled. He wrote on the Pope's writing, because he wrote this, and on his speech, and he wrote the following. In a major statement of the Roman Catholic Church's position on the theory of evolution, John Paul II has proclaimed that the theory is more than just a hypothesis, and that evolution is compatible with the Christian faith. In a written message to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the Pope said the theory of evolution has been buttressed by scientific studies and discoveries since Charles Darwin. And then this writer is going to say what is obvious. If taken literally, the biblical view of the beginning of life and Darwin's scientific view would seem what? Irreconcilable. In Genesis, the creation of the world and Adam, the first human, took 6 days. Evolution's process of genetic mutation and natural selection, the survival and proliferation of the fittest new species, has taken billions of years according to scientists. He says the biblical story and what scientists say cannot be reconciled. Pope Francis was even more explicit than Pope John Paul. I read now some things that Pope Francis had to say. This is at the top of page 359. The Big Bang, which today we hold to be the origin of the world, What does he mean when he says we hold? The papacy. Yeah. So the papacy believes in the Big Bang for the origin of the universe. The Big Bang, which today we hold to be the origin of the world, does not contradict the intervention of the divine creator, but rather requires it. So God has to intervene at certain stages in the process of evolution, is what he's saying. Evolution in nature is not inconsistent with the notion of creation, because evolution requires the creation of beings that evolve. In other words, God places in the beings the mechanism so that they can evolve, and God intervenes at certain stages to change maybe one species into another until this process of evolution comes to an end. Then he stated, when we read about creation in Genesis, we run the risk of imagining God was a magician with a magic wand able to do everything, but that is not so. He created human beings and let them develop according to the internal laws that he gave to each one of them, so they would reach their full or their fulfillment. So you'll notice that both of these popes, the most influential popes in the last 50 years, neither one of them believes that the story of creation happened literally the way Genesis says. They believe that it is a symbolic story, and that this world came into existence over the course of billions of years. In fact, according to the Big Bang theory, the evolutionary process of the universe began some 13.8 billion years ago, when a single speck of the universe exploded and the universe began to expand. And they believe that by examining the expansion of the universe and working towards the supposed beginning, that they can determine how long it took. And that's what these popes actually believe. Now, what are the devastating implications of believing that the story of Genesis is not literal, but this world came into existence in the course of billions of years? First, heterosexual marriage is based on the story of creation. Why do we believe that a man should marry a woman? Because in Genesis it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife. The foundation of heterosexual marriage is Genesis. But if the story of Genesis did not take place as the Bible says, what happens with heterosexual marriage? It disappears. Another problem is the foundation of gender identity is based on Genesis. The Bible tells us that male and female, He created them. He created two genders, male and female. But what happens if the story of creation wasn't literal? Well, gender identity disappears. It becomes even more serious. The Sabbath depends, the observance of the Sabbath depends on a literal story of creation. Because if that story isn't literal, and the world has come into existence over millions and billions of years, then there wasn't a first week of 6 days of work and one of rest. Therefore, we cannot copy or follow God's example. So the Sabbath is based on a literal story of creation. I'm not going to get into the issue of distinctive functions of men and women, but that also is found there in Genesis. That's a very controversial subject in the Adventist church now. Francis I constantly admonishes the strong to help the weak and the rich to help the poor. However, his counsel does not fit with the mechanism of evolution, because evolution functions based on the survival of the fittest, or natural selection, where the strong prevail and the weak disappear. If this is true, why should the strong help the weak and the rich help the poor? So his counsel doesn't square with his concept. Even more seriously, the papal view of origins destroys the expectation of a soon coming of Jesus. How many more millions of years do we have to wait for evolution to work out its wrinkles and flaws to reach the perfect omega point? How many times have you heard Pope Francis I refer to the second coming of Christ as the great hope of planet Earth? Never. Because the view of the papacy is not that Jesus is going to come to establish his kingdom here. The idea of the papacy is that the church will take over the reins of the state, resolve the problems of poverty, the problem of climate change, the problems with the family, the problems with immigration, and establish a perfect society here on earth. Because he doesn't believe in the story of creation. But it becomes even more serious. The evolutionary theory mars the beautiful character of God. It is an attack against the omnipotence of God. Doesn't God have the almighty power to create things instantaneously by speaking them into existence? That he has to use a method that takes billions of years? Isn't God powerful enough to make things right from the start? It's an attack against the omnipotence of God. It's an attack also against the omniscience and the wisdom of God. Is not God wise enough to create everything perfect from the start without having to use a method of trial and error where there is much suffering and death? It is also an attack on the grace and mercy and love of God, we're going to see. But let's go here to the middle of the page. It is a method of the survival of the fittest. The strong prevail and the weak succumb. It is contrary to the biblical principle that the rich should help the poor and the strong should help the weak. It is a method of trial and error where the process of evolution irons out the glitches. Does this reflect the biblical picture of God? Could not God get it right from the start? You know, there's a scientist, a Roman Catholic scientist, that wrote this. Evolution presents a bloody, ruthless struggle for existence from the very beginning, where there is much waste of living substance and many false starts and blind alleys. Does that sound like a wise God, like an omniscient God? Absolutely not. Does that sound, by the way, Jesus was the creator, does that sound like Jesus, who after feeding the 4,000 says, pick up all that's left over so that nothing goes to waste? And when he fed the 5,000, he said the same thing. Pick up everything that is left over that nothing goes to waste. With evolution, there's waste all over the place. It is an attack also against the love and mercy of God, as I was mentioning before. How can a God of love use a method where there is so much suffering, cruelty, pain, and death? Does this sound like a God who cares for the sparrows and dresses the lilies of the field? Would a God whose eye is on the sparrow use such a cruel method to create? It is also an attack against Jesus as the Savior. You see, this is very serious. If the Genesis account is symbolic, then the story of the fall is also what? Symbolic. And salvation simply means perfecting through the process of evolution. So it's an attack against the Savior. Notice that the Bible presents an unbroken chain. First, God created Adam and Eve perfect, with no inclination to sin. Adam and Eve ate from the literal tree of the knowledge of good and evil and literally fell into sin. Literally, the infection of sin passed from Adam and Eve to all their descendants. Because of that, death came in and passed to all human beings because of sin. Therefore, all humanity needs what? A redeemer from sin and death. But if there was death before sin, we face a serious problem. If there was death before sin, then the link between creation and sin and redemption is broken. That's the reason why Roman Catholic theologian Carl Schmitz-Moorman quoted, and this is quoted in the book Creation, Catastrophe, and Redemption, page 112. Remember, this is a Roman Catholic theologian. The notion of the traditional view of redemption as reconciliation and ransom from the consequences of Adam's fall is nonsense for anyone who knows about the evolutionary background to human existence in the modern world. Further, Salvation cannot mean returning to an original state, but must be conceived as perfecting through the process of evolution. It's a Roman Catholic theologian. Notice what Frank L. Marsh, a Seventh-day Adventist scientist, wrote. If death and the law of tooth and claw existed long before man, and if man evolved through these natural processes, then there could not have been a perfect Garden of Eden, nor a perfect Adam and Eve, nor could there have been a real fall in which man became subject to sin. If that is so, what is the theological meaning of Jesus' incarnation and atonement? Paul connects the two. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. And then he continues, if there was no Garden of Eden with its tree of life, what is the future that Revelation 22 depicts for the redeemed? The evolutionary theory destroys the biblical hope of the second coming of Christ, to restore the earth to its original perfection. If perfecting is through the process of evolution, how much longer must we wait until the process reaches its climax? Millions of years? Billions? How many more millions of years do we have to wait for the lamb and the wild beasts to lie down together in harmony? How many more millions of years? See, if you believe in evolution, it destroys the idea of a soon coming of Christ. Because our hope is not in Jesus coming to create a new heavens and a new earth. The hope is that we reach the climax of perfection through the process of evolution. And how much longer is it going to take is the big question. If we eliminate a literal beginning, a literal fall, a literal atonement, and a literal second coming, what is left? We might as well pack up our Seventh-day Adventist bags and join the ecumenical movement. Now, in spite of the fact that without exception, the Bible refers to the seventh-day Sabbath as God's day of rest, Pope John Paul II in his apostolic letter Dies Domini, and Pope Francis I in his encyclical Laudato Si, have declared that the seventh-day Sabbath is Jewish, and that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. Yet, as we have seen, never does the Bible refer to the Sabbath as the Sabbath of the Jews or the Jewish Sabbath. It is always the Sabbath of the Lord your God. God calls the Sabbath my holy day. In every single instance, the Sabbath is God's holy rest day because He made it holy by His rest. The Papacy claims that the Sabbath is a relic of the Jewish Old Covenant, and yet it continues a plethora of Old Covenant practices, such as sacrifices on altars, the use of holy vestments, the sprinkling of holy water, the burning of incense, the lighting of candles, the raising of shrines to the saints. In this, the Papacy swallows the camel and strains the gnat. They reject one of the 10 commandments, the Sabbath commandment, and yet they say that these other practices, which were part of the Old Covenant, still need to be practiced by the Christian church today. The simple fact is that Sunday cannot be holy because God did not rest on it. Jesus rested from creation on the Sabbath, from redemption on the Sabbath, and will rest from the new creation on the Sabbath as well. Even more seriously, if Pope Francis does not believe in the literal story of creation, then the Sabbath has no foundation. So far, so good. Now we need to talk about the Jesuit strategy. The Jesuits have a very particular agenda, and it's related to the philosophy of a well-known philosopher by the last name of Hegel. He theorized that history develops in 3 stages. He called it thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the theory as it applies to the papacy would work out like this. The thesis would be the dominion of the papacy during the 1260 years. The antithesis would be the French Revolution when communism and secularism arose against the papacy. And the synthesis would be the joining together of Catholicism and communism, the joining of forces. Now you say, is that possible? Is that what we're seeing today? Let's pursue it. John Paul II and Benedict XVI were popes of a dying breed. They were staunch defenders of papal authority and of the dogmas. Those are the doctrines of the church. During the conservative pontificates of John Paul II, by the way, he was head of what was known before as the Office of the Inquisition, and the period of Benedict XVI, the papal talking points focused primarily, and you know this because the moral majority did the same thing, the Christian coalition among Protestants. What was the focus? What were their talking points of John Paul II and of Benedict? They were conservative popes. They wanted to uphold Roman Catholic doctrines or dogmas. Their focus was primarily on marriage between a man and a woman, on euthanasia as being wrong, on abortion as something being criminal, which we certainly would agree with, against LGBT, and in favor of doctrinal orthodoxy. Of course, the political powers of the world and the secular media, including the United Nations, frowned on these causes. So the papacy needed to implement a more liberal agenda in order to win over the political powers of the world. As is well known, John Paul was a deadly enemy of communism and theologically very conservative. John Paul fought tooth and nail against communism in the Soviet bloc. And he and Ronald Reagan joined forces to attack communism in Central America. But there has been a papal shift. At the same time, postmodernism was eroding the idea that there is such a thing as doctrinal truth. It also denied that truth can be found anywhere outside our subjective experience, the experience of each human being. Thus, subjective truth, autonomous authority, took the place of objective truth and an absolute authority outside of man. Until recent times, the Roman Catholic Church has taught that dogmas are absolute truth, and the Pope is the absolute arbiter of what is truth and what is error. However, at Vatican Council II, which was celebrated from 1962 to 1965, things began to change. The catchword for the council was aggiornamento, that in Latin means renewal. According to conservative Vatican insiders, the council was a watershed event that diluted the authority of the Pope and the doctrinal orthodoxy of the Church. The confirmation of the truthfulness of the insiders' assessment would not take very long. In the 1970s, communism began causing problems in Central America. Those who are a little bit older remember the issue of the Contras during Reagan's time, right? In Central America, in El Salvador. The Jesuit bishops were not merely Roman Catholics in Central America, they were also communists. This is the synthesis, by the way. In the 1980s, the problems intensified as Catholic priests embraced liberation theology and began treating the Pope with disdain and disrespect. They hated John Paul II because he was conservative. The book by the late Malachi Martin, ever heard of him before? He wrote a book called The Jesuits. Get a copy of that and read it. That book was written in 1987. It was published in 1987. What he has in that book is what's happening in the church today, in the Roman Catholic Church today. So, this book, which was published in 1987, it was 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. In other words, before the fall of what was before the Soviet Union. Martin was a staunchly conservative Jesuit and a close friend of John Paul II. He was aghast of what the liberal Jesuits, which were the majority, were doing to change the power structure of the papacy and church doctrine. In his book, he documents in minute detail how John Paul II was treated with disdain and disrespect by the Sandinistas when he visited Nicaragua in March of 1983. He also documents how, beginning with Vatican II, the Jesuit order has watered down church doctrine and the authority of the Pope in order to make it easier to unite with Protestants, world political leaders, and scientists. Are you catching this picture? It is a documented fact that since the 60s, the Jesuits have been chipping away at the idea that church dogma is set in stone. They also questioned the idea that the Pope is the absolute arbiter of truth. They realized that in order for the papacy to gain the trust of political leaders of the world, it must embrace the causes that they stand for. Do the political leaders of the world stand for heterosexual marriage? Are you kidding? Are most of the political leaders, is the United Nations in favor of euthanasia? Sure. How about LGBT? Sure. How about open borders? How about climate change? Interesting. There is a real reason why Pope Benedict was strong-armed to retire from the papal throne. The papacy needed a liberal pope who would not focus on the orthodoxy of church dogma, because today people don't want to believe that anything is objective truth, or the authority of the Pope, but rather on causes that please the politicians of the world. Ellen White hit the nail on the head when she compared the papacy to a chameleon. Do you know what a chameleon is? It's a lizard that changes colors depending on where it is. This is what she wrote. The best description of the papacy I've ever read. It is part of her policy to assume the character which will best accomplish her purpose. But beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon, she conceals the invariable venom of the serpent. Benedict resigned or retired, but not of his own free will. The conversation topics needed to change so that the papacy would be more in harmony with the agenda of the United Nations and the world governments, because prophecy predicts that the papacy will be able to use the civil powers of the world to accomplish her agenda. See, sometimes we think that the union of Catholics with Protestants is the big thing. Listen, that's important, yes, Catholics and Protestants, but it's even more important to the papacy to gain the support of the political leaders of the world, to be able to use the state to accomplish its purposes. For that, it has to win over the political leaders and talk about what they want to talk about. Francis I is the first Jesuit pope in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. His focus is not on church doctrine or on the authority of the papal chair. He is a Catholic communist in the style of the Sandinistas of Central America in the 1980s. He has synthesized Catholicism with socialism. He is a theological liberal and does not care much about orthodox church doctrine. The key item on the papal to-do list to win the trust and confidence of the civil powers of the world, especially the United States, and then to advise them to implement its agenda. That's what the plan is. In order to accomplish this, the papacy has recognized that it must change its traditional talking points. During the pontificate of Francis I, the first Jesuit pope in history, as I mentioned, the traditional social talking points have all but faded from view. The Pope rarely mentions church doctrine or the authority of the papal chair. When approached on his view of gay marriage, he said, "Who am I to judge?" His topics of conversation are socialist, including climate change, poverty, spreading the wealth of rich nations to poor ones, doing things for the common good, open and free immigration. Is that what he's talking about? Of course it is. You see it in the news every day. By the way, how much has the Pope said about what's happening in Venezuela? Practically nothing. He says they just need to get together to resolve their differences. And Venezuela is a communist country. He's been very critical of Donald Trump in the United States. Political leaders and the United Nations can identify with these causes. The politicians of the world revealed their enthusiastic approval of the Pope's new talking points when the 193 nations represented gave the Pope a thunderous standing ovation for many minutes when he finished his inaugural speech at the 70th anniversary of the General Assembly of the United Nations in September of 2015. Ellen White wrote about the papal strategy of changing its appearance while retaining its basic principles. In Great Controversy 571, she wrote, "The Roman Church now presents a fair front to the world, covering with apologies her record of horrible cruelties. She has clothed herself in Christ-like garments, but she is unchanged. Every principle, not necessarily the doctrines, but every principle of the papacy that existed in past ages exists today." The most powerful man in the Vatican is not the Pope, but what is known as the Black Pope, because he's clothed in black. The Father Superior of the Jesuit order. We can see the shift away from church dogma in order to please the contemporary liberal postmodern mind. In an interview that Giuseppe Rusconi, that's a newspaper editor, had with Father Arturo Sosa Abascal, the recently elected superior of the Jesuit order, the Black Pope. And let me, before I read some things about that interview, let me just mention, I bet you can't guess where the Father Superior is from. Venezuela. It's very significant. This is the question that Rusconi asks. Cardinal Gerhard L. Müller, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that is the head of what was before the Inquisition, has said with regard to marriage that the words of Jesus are very clear. That is that Jesus married a man and a woman. And no power in heaven and on earth, neither an angel, nor the Pope, neither a council, nor a law of the bishops has the faculty to modify them. So in other words, he's the head of the Inquisition. He's responsible to uphold church doctrine. Now here's Abascal's answer, the Black Pope. So then, there would have to be a lot of reflection on what Jesus really said. At that time, no one had a recorder to take down his words. What is known is that the words of Jesus must be contextualized. They are expressed in a language, in a specific setting. They are addressed to someone in particular. In other words, they only apply to the times of Jesus. And so Rusconi asks the following question. But if all the words of Jesus must be examined and brought back to their historical context, do they not have an absolute value? Well, here's Abascal's answer. Over the last century in the church, there has been a great blossoming of studies that seek to understand exactly what Jesus meant to say. As if you don't understand male and female. Hello? That is not relativism, but attests that the Word is relative. The gospel is written by human beings. It is accepted by the church, which is made up of human beings. So it is true that no one can change the word of Jesus, but one must know what his word was. Are you seeing the seriousness of this? He's using the historical critical method, which is the liberal method of interpreting Scripture. I want you to notice also what he continues saying. The church, about church doctrine, the church has developed over the centuries. It is not a piece of reinforced concrete. It was born, it has learned, it has changed. This is why the ecumenical councils are held, to try to bring developments of doctrine into focus. Doctrine is a word that I don't like very much. It brings with it the image of the hardness of stone. Instead, the human reality is much more nuanced. It is never black or white. It is in continual development. Are you catching the picture? As I mentioned, Abascal is from Venezuela. And Pope Francis handpicked him. Why did the Pope handpick someone from an avowed communist country where poverty, disease, hunger, crime, civil unrest are the rule of the day? Why has not the Pope condemned the abuses of the communist government in Venezuela? Why has Abascal remained silent, even though he's from there, simply saying that both sides should resolve their problems by dialogue? Simply because the Pope and Abascal are both Catholic communists. Are you with me? Now the Pope has three main talking points. And all of them have to do with the observance of Sunday as the day of rest. First of all, the serious need to address the issue of climate change. You know, this is the horse that the Pope is riding now. There are multiple articles, I have in my computer, multiple articles that are coming out recently about groups in different places that are pushing for climate change. They're even influencing the children from schools to miss school. I think it's on Fridays, in protest because the leaders are not doing anything about climate change. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a Norwegian teenager who has been nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize because of her demonstrations against climate change, against not doing anything about climate change. Now, so he speaks about climate change. The Pope says the environment needs a day to rest. What day do you suppose that is? Sunday, of course. He says, listen, the capitalist overlords don't give their poor a day off. You know, all the stores are open on Sunday, athletic events on Sunday, and therefore, the workers, they're having to work and they don't have a time to rest. They need to get a day of rest from their capitalist overlords. I bet you can't guess what day he suggests. Sunday. Then he says the family, they're so busy during the week. They're taking the kids to the school and they're working and they just don't have any time to spend together as the family. The family needs a day when they can reconnect. I'll bet you can't guess what day that is. Sunday. I want to read this statement from his encyclical, Laudato Si. The Pope wrote, on Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist, that's what we call the Lord's Supper, has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, where does the Bible speak of the Jewish Sabbath? Anybody want to show me a verse where the Bible calls the Sabbath the Jewish Sabbath? It's always the Sabbath of the Lord your God. God says, it's my holy day. It's the day that God rested. So once again, on Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationships with God. Which is the day that God gave us to heal our relationships with God? The Sabbath. With ourselves, what day did God give us to kind of rest and retread? The Sabbath. With others, which day did Jesus use especially to heal and benefit others? Sabbath. And with the world. What is the problem with what the Pope is saying? Are these bad causes? Is it a bad cause to give the hard workers a day of rest? No. Is it bad to give the environment a day of rest? No. Is it bad for the family to be able to spend a whole day together to rest and reconnect? No. Where's the problem? He's got the wrong day. And so you say, who cares about the day? I can dedicate any day I want to God. That's what people say. Well, let's take a look at that. Remember the story of Nadab and Abihu? They took common fire and they offered it to God as if it was holy. And God said, you don't have to take the holy fire from the altar. Fire is fire. I don't care. Is that what God said? No. The Bible says that because they took common fire and offered it to God as if it was holy, fire came from the Lord and consumed them. Because they took the common and they presented it as if it was holy. Another story in Daniel chapter 5 is Belshazzar. He took the holy vessels and he treated them as if they were common. And what happened with him? He was slain that very night. So how do you think the Lord feels today when people take a common day of work, Sunday, and they make it a day of rest? And they take a holy day, like the Sabbath, and they treat it as if it were common. If God accepts that, He's going to have to apologize to Nadab and Abihu and Belshazzar. Because when God says it's the Sabbath, He means the Sabbath. He does not mean any other day. Now, what is the final test going to be all about? You know, it's about the mark of the beast and the seal of God, right? And that's what we've been discussing in the seals. You know, God's people will be sealed with the seal of God, and the wicked will be marked with the mark of the beast. Now, what is the real issue at the end of time? The great final test that will divide the world is not merely a matter of days, but rather a matter of authority. The observance of the Sabbath is a sign of loyalty and obedience to the Creator. The observance of Sunday is the sign of loyalty and obedience to the beast. Thus, the matter of days will test which authority you will obey. The first angel's message commands us to worship the Creator, and the third tells us not to worship the beast or the little horn. So, the final conflict has to do more with authority than just with days. Let me ask you, when we keep the Sabbath, whose authority are we recognizing? God's authority, because He established the Sabbath as a sign of creation. When we observe Sunday as the day of rest, who created Sunday as the day of rest? The Papacy. So whose authority are we recognizing when we keep Sunday? God's authority? No. We're recognizing the Papacy's authority. The little horn thought that it could change God's law. So behind the days is the issue of which authority we will obey. Now, you find in your syllabus several statements. We're not going to be able to read them all, but I want to read just one of them, and this is, and if we have time we'll read another, but on page 370, at the bottom of the page, right now, the Protestant churches are coming back to mother. There's a big ecumenical movement going on now, where Protestants have just said, let's forget about doctrine. And let's all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, my Lord. Let's just all get along. You know, let's care for the poor, and let's make sure that the climate change doesn't destroy the planet, and let us just emphasize the need for the family, and so on, and then everything will be okay. That's the emphasis these days. But when it comes to doctrine, Protestant churches say, don't focus on doctrine. That's not important. They also have been influenced by postmodern thinking. There's no such thing as absolute truth. Your truth is your truth, even if it contradicts reality and common reason. If you want to believe that 2 plus 3 is 7, well, that's your truth. It's okay. And if I want to believe that 2 plus 2 is 4, well, that's my truth. It's all right. But don't condemn me because I don't accept your truth. That's the mood of the day. It's postmodern thinking. The problem with the Protestant churches is that they were never able to totally sever their connection with the mother church they were born from. They did discard many of the things that linked them with the mother church. For example, they restored the idea that baptism, many of them did, that baptism is by immersion. They restored the idea that man is justified by faith without works of law. They restored many of the aspects that the church had gone astray from in the Bible. But there are some doctrines that the Protestant world was never able to discard and that still connects them with the mother. Things like Sunday as the day of rest, an eternally burning hell, and the idea of the immortality of the soul. So they still have a link or a connection with the mother, a doctrinal connection with the mother. And notice what John O'Brien, in the book The Faith of Millions, page 400 and 401, wrote. He was a professor many years at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, one of the great Catholic universities of the United States. He caught this nuance. He wrote, but since Saturday, not Sunday, is specified in the Bible, Isn't it curious that non-Catholics who profess to take their religion directly from the Bible and not from the church observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Yes, of course it is inconsistent. But this change was made about 15 centuries before Protestantism was born. And by that time, the custom was universally observed. They, that is Protestants, have continued the custom, even though it rests upon what? The authority of the Catholic Church, and not upon an explicit text in the Bible. And now here comes the key portion. That observance remains as a reminder of the Mother Church, from which the non-Catholic sects broke away. Like a boy running away from home, but still carrying in his pocket a picture of his mother or a lock of her hair. Are you catching the picture? In other words, there's still the desire to what? To return to Mother from where they left. We have time to read one other one at the top of page 370. It was the Catholic Church which, by the authority of Jesus Christ, that's questionable, has transferred this rest to the Sunday in remembrance of the resurrection of our Lord. Thus, the observance of Sunday by Protestants is an homage they pay, in spite of themselves, to the authority of the church. Once again, it's a matter of what? What authority do you obey? Why can't we keep Sunday as well as Sabbath? Well, let me give you the reason. My birthday is June 26. I'm not going to tell you the year. June 26. What day do you suppose my family celebrates my birthday? June 26. Why can't they celebrate on June 27? Because I wasn't born that day. You see, that event is rooted in history. You can't change an event that's rooted in history. So let me ask you, what day did God rest at creation? The seventh day. Can I say that it's Sunday? No, because it's an event that's rooted in history. And you cannot change the event that is rooted in history. That's why Ellen White says that when we keep the Sabbath, we commemorate the Creator's rest. Like on June 26th, you commemorate my birthday. You can't change the date of my birthday. You cannot change the day that God rested, because on Sunday, God did not rest. So we see these things happening right before our eyes. Things are happening very quickly. The final movements are rapid ones. And we need to make sure that in the trial ahead, we have the seal of God.